the janitor of the National Bank of Quincy, unlocked the thick doors to the vault, expecting another ordinary day. But what he saw was anything but ordinary. $5 million was missing from the so-called unbreakable vault, and the only thing the robbers left behind was a massive hole in the ceiling. Who were they? Where did they go? How did they break into the unbreakable vault? This is a story about a genius gang who outsmarted some of the smartest detectives on Earth, so let's get to it. Two inmates are put into a cell together. At first, they don't seem much alike, until they start sharing their passion about stealing. They realize they could make a great team once they get out of prison. After leaving prison, they quickly assembled a gang. It consisted of 4 people: Little Dave, Thomas Draper, George Mason, and Tom Bigelow. But something was missing. All of them were just regular thieves. They needed an insider, a guy with some advantage, a guy who could help them outsmart the authorities. That's when they stumbled upon William Edson. He was well known for making high security bank safes. He was like their secret weapon, and he agreed to help them. There was one problem though. If anyone saw Edson with the criminals, it was game over. Cause what would a bank security guy do with some well-known criminals? So they developed a system to communicate without them having to meet up in person. They would put up an ad in the local newspaper and then encrypt it so that no one except them could actually read it. The encryption probably looks something like this. Anyway, enough with all the boring stuff, let's get to the robbery. To pull off the biggest bank heist at the time, the gang needed some preparation. So they started off with some easier banks like the National Bank of Elmira in New York and the Falls City Bank in Kentucky. Then came the real challenge, the First National Bank in Quincy. 6 weeks before the heist. In a small rented house only a few minutes from the National Bank, the gang's plan was set into action. Step 1. Scouting the area. The last thing you want when robbing a bank is having to deal with security guys who are protecting the vault. You also don't want people working very late or people showing up extremely early. So the gang learned their patterns and figured out when to strike and when not to. Step 2. Get a key to the office. The criminals had found a brilliant way to do this using Edson's help. Instead of stealing the key from an employee and risking getting caught, they would instead sneak up to the office and then put wax into the keyhole. The wax would then take shape of the key. They then took this wax and put it into some compact sand. They then filled the shape with liquid metal. After around 15 minutes, they had an exact duplicate of the key. That would then lead them to step 3. Step 3. Removing the enclosure from the vault. Now came the tedious part. Every single day they had to sneak into the bank and chip away small parts of the enclosure and then cover it right after with something. They would do this with a small file and hammer. The reason they didn't get caught doing this was because they had learned the bank's schedule and they knew when there would be a guy in the office. And when they chipped at the enclosure, there would be people in the lobby talking and making noise. That way the chipping noises would blend in. They could then just casually walk out the bank with debris in their pockets. After only a few weeks, the hole had gotten big enough for them to peek down into the vault. Step 4. Breaking in and stealing everything from the vault. On the 13th of February, the gang sold everything in their small rented house to not leave any clues behind. They also rented a small room on the 3rd story of the nearby Walker building, so if anything went south, they would have a place to hide the cash. At around 1 a.m., the gang snuck out and were heading for the bank. Upon arrival, they quietly broke in and entered the office. Little Dave stood outside the bank looking out for any danger, while Thomas Draper went over and prepared the horse and buggy, so they were ready to get the hell out of there. Since they had already made a hole through the ceiling, all they had to do now was make it big enough to fit through it. That's why they had also brought a sledgehammer. They spent the next hour or so hammering through the rest of the enclosure until they finally broke through. 2 of the gang members would then strap a rope around Scott and slowly lower him into Vault 1. In the vault, they found cash and gold equivalent to $2.2 million. One problem: How would they get into Vault 2? They definitely wouldn't have enough time to break into that as well, except they did. Here's where Edson came into clutch. He had invented a new way to break into safes, and this was the first heist in history where it was used. He called it the air pump method. Edson took some Play-Doh substance and covered the lock in it. He would then create two small holes in the substance, one at the top and one at the bottom. At the bottom he would connect a suction device, and at the top a folded piece of paper with gunpowder on it. When he then started the suction, the gunpowder would spread through the lock. Then he would just stick a fuse into the top hole and light it. But there was one small problem. If they did that here, the guy in the vault would probably die from the explosion. So they pulled Scott out of the vault, took out their pistol and shot the fuse from the office. They then took cover from the explosion. The reason no one heard the explosion was because it came from inside the vault, which muffled the explosion a lot. Entering Vault 2, they found a bunch of personal valuables, and it is estimated that they were worth over $2.8 million, which means the gang got $5 million, which was the biggest bank heist ever at that time. But then came the real challenge, which brings us on to step 5. Step 5. Fleeing and not getting caught. Right after stealing everything, they jumped into a horse and buggy and headed north, and then they were never seen again. Is how the robbers would have wished the story went. The downfall. After leaving Quincy, the gang pulled off a couple more heists like a bank in Saratoga, the Long Island National Bank, a bank in Rockville, Connecticut, a bank in Covington, Kentucky, a bank in Pittston, Pennsylvania, and lastly, the Northampton National Bank. And you might think, if they got away with all of these bank robberies, how do we know so much about them? Yeah, that's the thing, they never got caught doing a heist. But they had one flaw. You remember the Edson guy? Yeah, him. He got like kinda mad and he just straight up snitched. He didn't think he got a big enough split of the money. And he just straight up starts talking about his past 10 years of activity with the gang. So Dunlap and Scott are taken to court and proven guilty of their involvement in multiple robberies, and the other members of the gang don't even face trial since there was a lack of evidence. Dunlap and Scott are sentenced to 20 years in prison, and since people didn't get as old as we do now, that was basically a death sentence, which it also turned out to be. Robert Scott died in 1882 after serving 10 years of his sentence. He dies because of the poor conditions in prison. And Dunlap was actually such a good criminal that the police used him as a consultant, and he actually got arrested for many more robberies after that. But the police bailed him out because he helped them solve a bunch of crimes. So this is actually only our second video ever, so if you enjoyed it, please subscribe. And also, if you want to see our first video ever, click here. It's about this guy who survived 4 months stranded on the sea. Also, please subscribe.